Hi everyone, Dr. Palmer here. In today's lecture, we're going to cover a lot of different issues that Sherman Alexi brings up in the second half of his book, Flight. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things such as violence and ordinary magic. So let's take flight. As always, there are vocabulary that you can focus your attention on. They will be appearing in quizzes and tests. So I recommend that you write down this list and take down the definitions and where these might apply within the book, but also the different examples that I might bring up, but also examples that you might observe from your own observations within life, but also within current events. The order of this vocabulary does not appear sequentially within this lecture. This is just an alphabetized version of the list. As always, I've provided questions to consider. I will refrain from reading them out loud, but these are just some things to think about as you read the book or as you review these chapters within the book, chapters 7 through 15. And I welcome you to answer, like write out the questions and post them in your discussion post, or you can just kind of keep them in the back of your mind and allow them to act as a guide while you're reading. In our protagonist's second body jump, Sherman Alexi conjures smell because, psychologically speaking, the olfactory sense is the strongest sense to invoke memories. As Alexi has Zitz point out, it is also often an overlooked piece of sensory information in retellings of history, either imagined or factual. In this section of the book, Alexi paints a picture of the heterogeneous camp of Native peoples as far as the eye can see. The historic facts of the historic events that Alexi draws on finds 10,000 natives gathered in greasy grass, also known as Little Bighorn, in defiance of U.S. government policy to move natives onto reservations and remove them from their homelands. A painting on the left by Charles Marion Russell in 1903 depicts the Lakota perspective of the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which 3,000 Lakota warriors killed 200 of General Armstrong Custer's men, along with General Custer himself. Another painting on the right side gives us another bird's eye view that juxtaposes the order of the U.S. cavalry with the chaos of the natives. General Custer is set center stage, heroically staged upon a stallion with his hand raised in combat, while bodies of warriors and soldiers fall and fly around him. His defeat is not depicted. Again, at center stage in history is Crazy Horse, the leader that brought the Lakota and other native groups that joined the battle to victory. In this part of the book, our protagonist, Zitz, brings up the issue of blood and racial purity when he says, "Unlike me, these Indians are the real deal." Alexi unpacks and forces his readers to address the idea of blood quantum and purity with regard to belonging. In this body jump, Zitz takes the form of a young native boy that has an intimate connection to his father. They're both depicted as being pure, as are the rest of the people in the camp, or so Zitz believes. In Zitz's observations of the camp that is housing thousands of natives, he sees Crazy Horse, and this idea of purity is further unpacked and smashed as he comes to the realization that Crazy Horse is actually mixed, just like Zitz. The idea of Crazy Horse and Zitz being biracial or bicultural is something I am going to unpack a little bit more when we talk about these ideas of multiculturalism, mixedness, and cultural capital. So this idea that many people draw their descent from multiple cultures or races and become iconic figures of resistance and or change is prevalent throughout United States history and culture, as well as in other nations where you have meetings of different cultures. Sociologist Paul Gilroy, who's actually Jamaican, argues that Bob Marley's proximity to whiteness, because his father was white, made and allowed reggae to become more popular and palatable to white audiences around the world. And it also helped launch reggae music's popularity across the world, and allowed other people to draw on reggae and kind of reform it into their own cultural histories. One could argue similarly with regard to the efforts and successes of Colin Kaepernick and Jesse Williams and even Barack Obama's, their levels of success, and with regard to Colin Kaepernick and Jesse Williams, their abilities to speak truth to power and to talk about structural violence that African Americans were facing at the hands of United States culture and police brutality, was, it could be argued, more widely accepted because of their light-skinnedness. Colin Kaepernick, who is half African American and half Italian, but given up for adoption and raised by white people, some would say this proximity to whiteness allowed for his movement to become more outspoken and progress to the popularity that it did. And because of their multicultural heritage, they were able to gain more acceptance to this larger white audience, just like Bob Marley did. In looking across the border at Canada, comedian Ryan McMahon, an Anishinaabe member, mentions how he opened his first TV special with the joke, ultimately cut for broadcast, that they only gave me this comedy special because they thought I was white. He argues that people who don't have to contend with trauma, quote, can sometimes go up the ranks more quickly because they can focus entirely on their careers. And Ryan does this in order to highlight his own privilege. Quote, it's not lost on me that when I walk in a room and some executive sits across from me, that I look like his nephew, possibly. Althea Arnok Baril, an Inuk filmmaker, further elaborates that it's not just the way a person looks that makes them more popular and more palatable to white audience. Quote, and sometimes it's fluency in English. Sometimes it's having an accent that people are familiar with and comfortable with, or an ability to code switch so that you can drop your native accent when necessary. Sometimes it's mannerisms and etiquette. So I think people who have that proximity to whiteness are often promoted up the ranks. In social science, these ideas of having a certain way of speech or knowing certain names to drop or different mannerisms is called cultural capitalism. And this term was coined by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu in 1973 to designate the accumulation of knowledge, behaviors, and skill that a person can tap into to demonstrate one's cultural competence and social status. This term first appeared in a paper called Cultural Reproduction and Social Reproduction, which was co-authored by Jean-Claude Pesson. While cultural capital within nations built on the premise of white supremacy, such as the United States, is used to climb social ladder because of proximity to whiteness, either physical or cultural, that there are those that might be white by their heritage, pass as something other than white, speaks to the complicated nature of identity politics of individuals and of race more generally. Additionally, because of the diversity of physical attributes of minority groups, and because of the multiculturalism and intercultural exchanges of many global metropolitan societies, people's ability to pass for an identity they were not necessarily born with is ever present. So there are many examples throughout history that showcase people passing as white to obtain social mobility. Recently, however, many people throughout the Western world have done the reverse and passed as Black. For instance, Rachel Dolezal, Jessica Krug, and Anthony Ekundayo Lennon are a few examples that are most recent. These are three people of European descent who were able to pass as Black and became respected members of the community based on their cultural capital, their knowledge of African American mannerisms, speech, and historical and performative knowledge. All of these three people worked and mentored African-descended youth. All three were teachers and performers of Blackness, and all three had jobs or gained artist in residency programs that were reserved for people of African descent. All three were also eventually called out, their careers ruined, and one, Anthony Lennon, even lost his life, or took his own life rather. So a little bit more about Rachel Dolezal, and then we'll go into Jessica Krug and a little bit about Anthony Lennon. Dolezal was born and raised in Montana by a white family with adopted siblings, which were of African American descent and Haitian. She attended Howard University, which is a historically Black university, and she moved to Spokane, Washington, where she married a Black man and integrated into the African American community. She was an instructor at Eastern Washington University's Africana Education Program, and she taught courses such as the Black Woman Struggle, African and African American Art History, African History, and African American Culture. Oh, and Intro to Africana Studies. Dolezal also held the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's President title for the Spokane chapter. While many people admonished her actions and her passing and taking a chance away from an actual woman of color to, teach and mentor youth and to have leadership positions. Interestingly enough, pop star Rihanna came out in her defense in a Vanity Fair interview in 2018. Quote, "I think she was a bit of a hero because she kind of flipped on society a little bit. Is it such a horrible thing that she pretended to be Black? Black is a great thing. And I think she legit changed people's perspective a bit and woke people up." While most people that love Rihanna decided to go against her and tweet and write about how she is setting people back, This one tweet that I have posted here on this slide says, and just because someone has a different thought doesn't mean they are an enemy of the cause. Because indeed, while Rachel Dolezal and others such as Jessica Krug lied about their heritage, lied about how they grew up, lied about their experiences, the fact that at least with Rachel Dolezal, that she actively spoke out against racism, and she mentored young Black youth, and she was a leader in her community for to promote African American rights, is actually it really tangles up, like, is the good that a person does, should it be erased because maybe they have a little bit of a past? And indeed, it is kind of troublesome that she might have taken a space where a person of color could have used that space to climb up the social ladder. The fact that she still did some good and that she inspired others should not be kind of overlooked, just as Rihanna stated. Another person who is in the center, Jessica Krug, was a professor of Latin American and African history at George Washington University. She had various background stories. She was African American, she was Afro-Latina. She was actually a tenure-track professor. And arguably she was very outspoken and played on the various stereotypes of and tropes, if you will, and narratives that typify African American women. She actually, unlike Rachel Dolezal, who was outed, Jessica Krug outed herself because she got wind of buzz that she was going to be, or her heritage was coming under attack. And so she put out a statement to try to minimize the damage. However, the fact that she was actually of Jewish descent, and she was from St. Louis, and she tried to break ties with her sanguine relations, you know, the relations that are of blood, and even decided to refrain from going to her own mother's funeral in fear of being outed, speaks to how deep people will kind of create these images of themselves and cultivate identities. Lastly, we have Anthony Okundayo Lennon, who was a British performance artist, and he was outed as passing for Black man to win an 18-month residency in a London theater group. That was specifically designated for a person of African descent. So Mr. Lennon had 30 years experience performing and working in Black theater groups. He, in the 1990s, and there's an image of him, a still image from a documentary series on Black identity in London, where he appears to look like he is of, you know, maybe mixed descent. In that documentary, Mr. Lennon is asked about his heritage among a group of his young Black contemporaries, and he says in the video, "I'm from Ireland." One of his Black contemporaries mishears him and says, "Oh, You're from the island? What island? Because in London, because England is a former, it's a former imperial nation that had lots of territories that it ruled over in the Caribbean. One of the black men asks, "Oh, what island?" And Lennon states, "No, I'm from Ireland." Ireland, he repeats. I'm white. My both of my parents are white. And then the conversation kind of continues and unravels with the contemporaries asking him, to kind of unpack his heritage and questioning his African descent because of his phenotype and the way he looks. And in looking at him, he really does look like he is of some sort of African descent. Another issue that this brings up is, like this idea of lineage and, patrilineal or matrilineal. There are groups within the world that believe that it is only your mother who can determine your true identity because the identity of the mother is always known, whereas the identity of the father can always become in question, right? Because a mother gives birth to a child, whereas the father only kind of donates sperm, right? And so the fatherhood can always be contested. And so this idea with, when we look at this example of Mr. Lennon, perhaps he actually was or has some African blood within him, but because of, the marriage, the relation between his mother and father, maybe there was an affair, we have no idea. And unless he was to do like some sort of thing like ancestry.com, and, reveal, you have like 20% African blood in you, that would clear up a lot of questions. With that said, he continued on his life, kind of living as and working in, as a person in Black theater. And he eventually just embraced, like, yeah, sure, I'm mixed, to the extent that, people accepted him because, he had this kind of Black phenotype, or he looked, a little bit African American. Or sorry, not African American because he's British, African, and therefore he was accepted by the community. And so when people started outing him, and the media picked up on it and started doing stories about him, it actually kind of ruined his career, ruined his standing in the performance community. The residency program actually, outly defended him and outspokenly rather, defended him and spoke how they knew about his heritage, and contested, these ideas that he was, faking Blackness, and that he was performing an identity that was not his own. He also had many of his contemporaries come out and speak in his defense. With all that said, he was constantly being attacked in the media and in his public life, to the extent that eventually he took his own life, which is, a very sad thing. And all of these these examples kind of bring out this question of what does it mean to belong to a certain group? Is it our blood quantum? Is it our heritage? Is it the acceptance of a community, right? And yeah, we'll talk about this in the next slide a little bit about some other examples that go beyond whiteness and blackness. After Dolezal's story broke, Rebecca Tuvel, a philosophy professor, in 2016 article in defense of transracialism, critiqued American racial politics by linking the notion of race and gender as social constructions. If both identifiers are social constructions and we as a society accept transgender individuals, can we as a society not accept transracial individuals? To quote Tuvel in her abstract, quote, her story gave notoriety at the same time that Caitlyn Jenner graced the cover of Vanity Fair, signaling a growing acceptance of transgender identity. Yet criticisms of Dolezal for misrepresenting her birth race indicate a widespread social perception that it is neither possible nor acceptable to change one's race in the way it might be to change one's sex. Considerations that support transgenderism seem to apply equally to transracialism. Although Dolezal herself may or may not represent a genuine case of a transracial person, her story and public reaction to it serve helpful, illustrative purposes. End quote. Unfortunately, many criticized Tuvel's argument, and she even got death threats. But her observations, although not widely accepted by academia or the public, creates a space for us to examine other examples of transracialism and this idea of passing, specifically within Indian country. And when I say Indian country, I mean indigenous Native American communities. So two examples come to mind, and they appear here in this slide. So we have Sylvester Clark Long, who was born in 1819 in North Carolina. So North Carolina during this time was under the control of Jim Crow segregation laws, when people of African descent were segregated and prohibited from accessing privileges that were reserved for other groups, namely white people. As a person born of African descent, Long's social mobility and access to resources were limited. But Long had ambitions and left North Carolina to play Indian in Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows that were popular at the time. Long eventually adopted the name Buffalo Child Long Lance. And from now on, I'll continue to refer to him as Long Lance. So in 1909, Long Lance applied to Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, an infamous boarding school that took indigenous children away from their native communities and taught them various industrial arts so that they could assimilate and be service to American society. So building on Long Lance's original story about being half Cherokee, he gained acceptance into Carlisle Indian School and actually graduated at the top of his class in 1912. And among his classmates included Olympian Jim Thorpe, as well as Geronimo's son, the famous Apache warrior. Eventually, Long Lance made his way to Canada and became an outspoken advocate for Native rights. While there, he claimed Blackfoot descendancy. His musical talents, which he learned at Carlisle Indian School, his education and cultural knowledge of both Indians and whites earned him social mobility that hoisted him into the elite white society and gained him membership in the exclusive Explorers Club in New York City. Longlands wrote books, and he was paid to give talks about Indian life on the plains. However, it was his foray into film that was his ultimate undoing. While working on The Silent Enemy, an epic of the American Indian, which was supposed to portray traditional Ojibwe life. Ojibwe is another name for Anishinaabe people. One of his fellow actors, a native actor, questioned his backstory because he didn't have a fluidness and a consistency with his story. This fellow actor of his found out that he had African blood, and according to the United States law of hypodescent, which dictates that any person with one drop of African blood is considered black, Longlands lost all credibility and became a social pariah because to have black blood during this time period was unacceptable. Unfortunately, this ruined his career, and in 1932, Longlands was found dead of a gun wound that was deemed self-inflicted, and so his death was ruled a suicide. And this is kind of similar to Mr. Lennon's recent story in 2018 in London, where he was outed and, because of the public losing faith in him, took his own life. Another example, a little bit happier story in its end, is Iron Eyes Cody, who was born Espera or Oscar de Corti in 1904 to immigrants from Sicily in Louisiana. So like Longlands, Cody performed in Wild West shows across the country, and he played Indian. He appeared in hundreds of TV shows and films, and even became the face of the 1960s and 1970s anti-pollution campaign to, quote, keep America beautiful, end quote. The iconic commercial and still images that feature Cody as a native man dressed in full Indian regalia who sheds a single stoic tear at the sight of trash thrown on the sides of the road and pollution on the banks of the river he just canoed down became a movement that played on people's romanticized stereotype visions of what it meant to be Native American. What's interesting, though, is that this campaign actually lowered trash and pollution in 38 states by about 80%. So he had a really big impact. And in growing up and watching nature shows, this commercial was often played in between the scenes, yeah, people of my generation are familiar with this. And actually even famous comedian Dave Chappelle invokes this in his stand-up comedy in the early 2000s. So anyway, like Longlands, Cody claimed several lineages that included Cherokee and Cree, but because he often changed his place of birth or the various circumstances of his early life, his heritage came under question. However, in the circles that he traveled with, that were not necessarily native, so he, was in a lot of non-native circles. He had enough cultural capital to pass as Indian. In 1936, Cody married a Seneca woman, or a Seneca descent woman, who was called Gayewas, and the two adopted native children, and promoted native culture within non-white society, namely through Order of the Arrow, which is an offshoot of the Boy Scouts. And anyone who is familiar with Boy Scouts of America and International Order of the Arrow, they have a lot of Native American symbolism and rituals that they kind of play Indian. So he found, community and leadership in those two groups. So although Iron Eyes Cody was outed as being non-native in 1996, Higgs worked to promote Native causes while simultaneously stroke the ego of American settler communities, and to portray people in general with dignity did not go unnoticed, which earned him a long and happy life. Cody died at the age of 94 and is interned in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. His and Long Lance's stories were both featured in the 2009 documentary Real Injun, to examine what it means to be Indian in the eyes of outsiders to Native communities and in Hollywood. The film likewise unpacks the complicated issue of identity politics in North America, and really unpacks this idea of this very solid idea that we have in the United States of race and racial identity. And one of the things that Sherman Alexi does in this book, Flight, with his protagonist Sitz, is try to unpack these issues of race and identity and senses of belonging. So let's look at multiculturalism in Haudenosaunee country. So going back to Alexi's description of the Indian camp, where Zitz does his second body jump. This actually shows the heterogeneity of Indian country. And in fact, many Native communities before and after European settlement were sites of multiculturalism. So people spoke multiple languages, and even if they did not necessarily speak the same language or each other's languages, they were able to understand multiple languages. Intermarriage was common as a method of solidifying friendships and bonds. So this continues today, and if you travel to any reservation or Native community outside reservations, you will find members of different tribes participating in nation and community life. One small example that I'm going to talk about right now is Iroquois communities and the people who call themselves Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. So these images that I have up here represent different aspects of Haudenosaunee culture. So Hiawatha Belt which represents the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and peace among the nations. So this is made out of wampum shells, and maybe you've heard this idea of wampum in American culture. Wampum is often misclassified as being money. It is made out of shells, the quahog shell, and each bead represents one shell. So these shells were compiled in belts to signify specific notable events within a community and between communities. So this Hiawatha belt represents the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So prior to 1142 in AD, the separate communities, there were separate communities, each with their own language, but maybe overlapping traditions of matriarchy or female-headed leadership, matrilineal kinship, which determined belonging through the mother's heritage, and other cultural traditions and creation stories. So these different ethnic groups, which incorporate or were made up of Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and also neutral groups and Huron. There was a lot of war in these territories, and brutal battles and war were waged against each other. So it wasn't until a young Huron prophet, affectionately known as the Peacemaker, or Daganawida, gathered an Oneida man known as Hiawatha for his leadership skills, who was living amongst the Mohawk people, and a woman known as Jinkosase, also known as the Peace Queen from Neutral Nation. Daganawidas asked these two people to journey with him to the feared and evil sorcerer named Tadadaho, who lived in Onondaga territory. So Tadadaho was said to be a powerful man with snakes in his hair. He practiced cannibalism and promoted war between the neighboring nations. It is said by Diane Hill, a contemporary Mohawk healer from Six Nations territory in Canada. She tells the story that Tadadaho had been banished to the forest wilds by his mother for the chaos and mischief that he created as a young boy. So, him being banished by his mother at a very young age, he lacked the motherly touch and love, and it made him all the more bitter, and his power to create chaos actually grew as he aged. As Hill tells it, the Daganawidas, Hiawatha, and Jinkosase, the Peace Queen, traveled together as a triad to Onondaga territory, where they met the evil sorcerer Tadadaho. Ultimately, it is said that because the sorcerer had longed for his mother's touch for so long, when Jinkosase, the Peace Queen, actually physically touched Tadadaho in a tender way, this tenderness brought Tadadaho back to remember his mother's touch, and this melted his cold heart, and thus peace was promoted through the neighboring lands. This peace was commemorated through the making of this wampum belt, the Hiawatha wampum, and is said that each bead can be read by special knowledge keepers, and each bead represents specific events and people based on their proximity to each other and their placement on the belt, and in promoting peace. It is also said that during this time of creating peace, Jinkonsanse cooked a meal for the group, for everyone to share, to use one spoon and one dish to eat this meal. A wampum belt was also created to symbolize this specific symbolic meal and what it represented. So this meal helped to solidify Daganowita's prophecy of peace throughout the 5 nations. Those 5 nations again being Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. By sharing a meal and eating from one dish and one spoon, it was agreed that the uncultivated territories between the nations would be shared equally by the member groups in being able to hunt and gather and sustain each other. Each nation would have equal rights to the resources. The spoon represented the absence of ill will or violence because knives were forbidden with this symbolic meal, as they would lead to bloodshed. So this is not only commemorated in the actual wampum belt, but it is also commemorated when the great chiefs come together and they actually eat to recollect and renew this peace treaty between those native nations. So it is from this practice that the separate nations made peace and continue to make peace with each other while maintaining their separate national identities. This also represents the Hiawatha Belt also represents and mimics the mapping of the territory in what is now mostly New York State. And we see the map that shows the 5 original nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the Seneca Nation is represented by the far left square, which they are keepers of the western door. The Cayuga are the members in the square to the immediate right of the Seneca. The Onondaga are the central fire keepers where the peace tree lies in the center, and they are represented by the tree in the center of the Hiawatha Belt. The Oneida lie just to the east of the tree, and the Mohawk represented by that square at the far right or east section of New York Territory, and the easternmost part of Haudenosaunee Territory, Confederacy Territory, and they are keepers of the eastern door. And so with this unity between these 5 nations, and later the Tuscarora were invited up from North Carolina, Haudenosaunee became a powerful entity, which their neighbors to the south, which included, and this is not a exhaustive list of nations, but it included the Cherokee, Delaware, and Tuscarora, as well as their neighbors to the west. Again, not an exhaustive list, but this included the Anishinaabe. This confederacy gained the respect and fear of their neighbors. And so as a result, trade, tribute, diplomacy, and intermarriage was common before European settlement. And so when Europeans did encounter these native groups, they found heterogeneous communities. And so when these Europeans arrived in the 1600s, work was needed to establish relations and rights between these five nations and the newcomers. So the first newcomers in this territory were the Dutch, and much like the Hiawatha Belt, that solidified a relationship and peace between those five nations. A wampum belt was created to designate the roles and determine peace among the Dutch and Haudenosaunee. This is represented by the two-row wampum, which you can see here on the slide in the upper right corner. The two-row wampum, similarly to the Hiawatha Belt, designated peaceful relations between the new arrivals and their indigenous counterparts. The white field of wampum beads symbolized peace in the land and on the territory, and the purple represented the two separate nations, keeping to their own paths. So kind of like, you stay in your road, I'll stay in my road, and we'll, just keep on moving in our own paths, and we won't interfere with each other. And as long as that happens, there will be peace. And then the final example of multiculturalism and this idea of multiculturalism and heterogeneity in Haudenosaunee country and territory is the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua, as seen and depicted in the painting by Robert Griffin at the bottom right of this slide. So this Treaty of Canandaigua, which is renewed and recognized, if you will, polished in every November since 1794, formed peace between the newly United States nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this wampum belt, which represented the treaty for the Haudenosaunee and the document that went alongside the written document that was provided by the Europeans, established the recognition of each of the sovereign nations' rights to land and liberty. Unfortunately, real life informs fiction, and many of the treaties between the indigenous and settler nations were broken, and this continues to play out within the violence that has occurred between different Native nations and settler nations, and this is partly what Sherman Alexi invokes within his not only flight book, but within other stories that he has written. So throughout Flight, Sherman Alexi tackles the power of revenge and how interpersonal violence creates cycles that are difficult to break. In the second body jump of our protagonist, we see how love can be twisted into acts of violence and revenge. Inhabiting the tween-age body of a full-blooded Indian boy, Zitz finds the love of his father that he has been longing for, but when he goes to speak, he finds his throat has been cut. When a young white soldier is captured by the native community in which he has traveled to, the teenager's father places a knife in his son's hand and urges him to take what was taken from him. But Zitz, who is inhabiting the boy's body, fights back. He begins to feel sick in the same way he felt sick when he had jumped into the FBI agent's body and was encouraged by his partner to shoot the traditionalist Indian, whose name is Junior. Alexi shows us through Zitz that this act of violence and the cycle of violence, this cycle of revenge, how it can create feelings of sickness, especially when you have that close, direct violence. When it's kind of more anonymous violence, such as when Zitz was in the bank and he just shoots up a bunch of people, and there's like really dehumanization of the people. It's easy, right? But when we get one-on-one and we see the eyes of the people and we see the humanness, it becomes a little bit more violent and visible, definitely, but also sickening. So, to quote Alexi, quote, "Happiness never lasts long." Zitz says as he realizes all these old-time Indians are doomed, end quote. So we see this violence playing out in U.S. history and through our contemporary lives. And within the culture of the United States, sanctioned terrorism of Indian nations and people by United States cavalry and individual soldiers as that direct violence that is embedded in hundreds of years of U.S. Native relations. It's also seen in the same way that Alexi shows us in these chapters. In breaking treaties with Native nations, United States engaged in structural violence that is unseen. The structural violence becomes embedded in the culture, leading to poverty, corruption, and division in the United States and Native agents that Alexi hints at in the first body jump that puts Zitz in the FBI agent Hank. Cultural violence, as seen in this triangle of violence, is intimately connected with structural violence. And we see this in various forms of cultural appropriation, and we see the invisible toll it takes on people's lives. It is more insidious and less visible, but still scars people. And while the scars might not be visible, the empirical facts that link cultural violence to other types is present and real, has real life lasting impacts. So cultural violence includes, for instance, prohibiting people to practice their religion openly, as was done to Native peoples until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Public Law number 95-341, 92, Statute 469, codified at 42 U.S. Congress in 1996, is a United States federal law that enacted by the joint resolution of Congress. And then we also have, so up until then, 1978, Native Americans were legally prohibited from practicing various indigenous native religious rites. So when people do sweat lodges or another common things that Euro-Americans do are sun dances, where people take bones and place them into deep wounds in their chest and kind of hang in the sun by cords until the flesh breaks, or they have, this is done to invoke visions and to promote healing. Those were prohibited from being practiced in Native communities. And now when people do them, when Native communities do them, they do this with the knowledge and the history that they were prohibited at one point, and that their people suffered when they were caught practicing these things, and they had to do them underground. And when other groups of people, such as Euro-Americans, do it without that same history or the same, suffering, they appropriate and they kind of lose the value. Another aspect is, wearing, having supermodels, wear different regalia that is not meant to be worn by women or not be frivolously displayed, because in the case of the supermodel and the runway, wearing the headdress in Plains Native communities, those headdresses represent leadership, and each feather is a representative and symbolizes the leadership of a person's ability to either create war or create peace. And so by this supermodel donning a feathered headdress, it takes away that, heavy responsibility that those Native community members were charged with to, do these acts of war or diplomacy. And then another example of cultural appropriation as perpetrated by fashion models is this European model donning a Sikh headdress. Sikhs are native to India and Pakistan. Their turbans worn by men are a religious pact that is donned by adherents to the Sikh religion with their deities. And it also shields their hair, which is grown as a pact. It's never cut, and it's grown as a pact to seal that relationship with their religion and their spiritualness. So to have a person who is not Sikh just kind of wear this as, like, hey, a fashion statement really takes away from the cultural significance and the spiritual significance, and commits cultural violence to, specific communities. And then some other examples of structural violence, which I have some images here, are redlining, which kept people of color, especially African Americans, out of prime real estate in the United States, while reserving the best sites for Euro Americans. And this practice is on par with reservation policies and systems that remove Native Americans from prime land to make room for economic and agricultural development of the best lands for Euro-American settlers. Cultural violence also includes misappropriation, again, of symbols and cultural items that of people that do not belong to those groups, and ethnic cultural groups who were actually discriminated for wearing or using these symbols and practices. So these, again, come hand in hand with other forms of violence when certain groups or classes of people are seen to be more worthy of law and justice than others. And so this relates to the idea of when women of color, including indigenous women and African American or Hispanic women, when they go missing or violence is direct visible violence is done to them, they are actually rendered less visible than when white women go missing. And this movement, this actually became a national movement that grew within the past few years of hashtag MMIA or MMIW, which stands for Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, to bring to light the fact that there is a high percentage of Native women that go missing every year, and they never receive either the respect for law enforcement to actually investigate those missing women, and they never get the media attention that is given to non-Native women, especially Euro-American women. And then this little infographic talks about the intersection of race and gender in media representation of missing persons. And so it talks about how 14.32% of Black women that go missing are in the media. The percentage of white women is much, much higher, even though they make up 49.74% of missing women. So although Sherman Alexi is from Coeur d'Alene Nation in Idaho, this book invokes specific battles and references to Plain Indians because Plains Indians and what American culture calls the Sioux Indians and what they call themselves is Lakota and Dakota. The Plains Indians are the kind of iconic trope of what non-Native people picture when they picture Native Americans. And so the Lakota and Dakota people, for which the states take their name, continue to live in their homelands, albeit in relegated reservations, despite the displacement from their homelands, the landscape still holds sacredness that the United States continues to inflict violence upon. So the Black Hills, as they are known in English, is the site of Mount Rushmore, built between 1927 and 1941, that 4 U.S. presidents were carved into the sacred mountains, and that these 4 presidents who had tenuous relations and policies with Native nations were carved into this sacred site is a form of both structural and cultural violence that Lakota and Dakota people have to contend with on a daily basis. So it's no wonder that they suffer from alcoholism and a high rates of suicide, which Sherman Alexi, he brings up the former issue of Indians being stereotyped as alcoholics when he, talks about Zitz's father. And one of the reasons is because when you constantly see your colonizers and your oppressors in these symbolic oppressive views, it can really wreak havoc on the psyche of individuals and families, which leads to dysfunction and interpersonal violence. So ironically, going back to the Black Hills and this issue of Mount Rushmore being carved into the Black Hills, ironically, in an effort to quote, end quote, right the wrongs of the past, a monument to Crazy Horse, that half-breed native who led the charge to defeat General Custer and his cavalry. A monument to Crazy Horse was decided to be built and constructed within those same Black Mountains, and Black Hills, and it is supposed to be, when it's finished, to be the largest monument in the world. So while this mammoth effort seeks to commemorate a Native hero, that same monument requires the continued destruction of the sacred space and adds insult to injury, continuing the disrespect and cultural violence perpetrated by the United States and non-Native outsiders. And something that is a little bit maybe more contemporary, even though the construction of the Crazy Horse Monument is an ongoing and continuous effort. Similarly, the Water Keepers movement that protested the No DAPL or North Dakota Access Pipeline movement to protect sacred land rights and life-giving waterways from petroleum pipeline to move this product across the United States was met with all 3 forms of violence: interpersonal or direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So peaceful protests and the peaceful protesters were known as the Water Keepers. They were pepper sprayed by police officers in the Dakotas. They were arrested. They had dogs set on them and attacked them. This is not unlike the violence that was perpetrated against Black civil rights leaders within the 1960s. Another interesting thing about the water keepers and the protests against No Dapple were police officers from outside states were called in to intimidate and brutalize the peaceful protesters. And when Lakota and Dakota people claimed that not only were these lands and waterways being threatened, but that these were sacred burial grounds, Euro-American archaeologists were called in to examine and find evidence or not find evidence, so that they could move on with their construction. So when these non-native archaeologists did come in and they did their studies and they didn't find any evidence, they committed cultural genocide and helped to greenlight the project. Because when you see what archaeologists fail to recognize and realize is that while many Plains Indians do bury their dead, there are many environmental reasons that prohibit this practice. And there are alternative ways of dealing with human remains, which many groups, including Mongolians and Tibetans, engage in. So Plains natives, which Lakota and Dakota people are kind of known as, they engage in a practice which involves placing a deceased person on a built scaffold or within a tree and allow birds of prey and scavenger birds like vultures to come and consume the fleshy parts of the body. You know, like these places, these plains areas, you know, in the Dakotas, within the United States, these similar territories, geographically speaking or topographically speaking, in Mongolia and Tibet, they're very cold places. The landscape does not readily allow for burials. Land freezes, and so there are alternative methods, of which scaffolding is one of them. So when the body is removed of all of its flesh, bones are remain, and then they're often taken and put into ossuaries in a separate location, or dealt with in various sacred, culturally specific ways. And each group around the world has their unique cultural practices. But without this cultural knowledge, non-natives, regardless of their academic accolades and their degrees, would find no evidence and would not know even where to look, and then thus they would overlook the sacredness of the space because no material evidence existed. And so this is part of the reason why the North Dakota pipeline was actually green-lighted, and this continued violence, this cultural violence was perpetrated both by the United States government and by commercial interests. And so I love maps, and this map really does a wonderful job of showing the way and the progression of Euro-American settlement moved in and displaced native groups throughout the history of the United States. So this started with, it doesn't start, you know, from the very beginning of Europeans coming into the territory, because we're looking at a site between the early 1800s to kind of present day in what's called like the Indian Wars, and when reservations were enacted, and so we can see how, like at one point, like all of the lands were, native territories, and then suddenly, like those little red parts are very tiny areas, and the areas within the East Coast are not even really represented, and we see that, there are some places within the East where there are no people, no reservation territories. And when we're looking at these ideas of colonialization, dehumanization, and structural violence, even our monetary bills, right? Each of our dollar bills has a president, other than the $100 bill, who's Benjamin Franklin, but he was a founding father of the United States. But the other bills have presidents who had very tenuous relationships with not only Native groups, but also African Americans and other people of color. Specific to Native Americans, we have Andrew Jackson, who is on the $20 bill, and it's been slated and planned that Harriet Tubman is actually going to replace his face on the $20 bill. I just want to make a note that Andrew Jackson was responsible for the removal of Native Americans against the will of the United States, and he was instrumental in driving the five, what they're called, the 5 civilized nations, which included the Cherokee, through to Oklahoma, and led them from territories in the Carolinas and in Georgia, to displace them and move them through the Trail of Tears, where many hundreds and thousands of people died, where they lost a lot of their cultural practices and territories, and moved to Oklahoma, a place where they were not, that wasn't their homeland, and put them in direct conflict with, people that were already living there. And so this is a result of, Native policies. So while I am completely for removing Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill, and I think that, it's a form of decolonization, I feel like it might be a little bit more appropriate to place maybe a Cherokee leader in his stead, or maybe create like a Trail of Tears on at the very least on one side of the bill, to commemorate what Andrew Jackson actually did. And maybe Harriet Tubman would be better suited in place of maybe George Washington or one of the other presidents that actually owned slaves. Not to say that Andrew Jackson didn't also own slaves. Alexi brings up the issue of boarding schools in his book, although he doesn't go deeply into it. That the policies lasted up until the 1960s in the United States is worthy of brief mention when discussing violence and framing of Native American familial dysfunction that Alexi draws on through his protagonist Zitz. Boarding schools, also known as residential schools, were used as tools of assimilation. Although they might be most infamous here in the United States for stealing young Native children, cutting their hair, swapping their traditional dress for European suits and dresses, and prohibiting and punishing children for using their indigenous languages, that similar practices to tame nomadic and minority peoples throughout the world existed often goes unnoticed, and that these policies continue throughout the world also similarly goes unnoticed. On the right hand, we see a photo of a group of young Lakota boys in the late 1800s when they were first taken into a residential school, juxtaposed to images of them after their re-education in a residential school. The picture on the right hand shows a group of Sami people who are indigenous nomadic people in Scandinavia that were beginning their assimilation journey to national settled life through boarding schools. Not only did both groups of indigenous children suffer the violence of being removed from their families and all their culture being taken away. They were also subject to interpersonal violence and sexual abuse at the hands of their teachers, many of which were affiliated with various Christian sects, or they were nuns or priests outright. Now that these are just two examples, and these cases are prevalent throughout the Americas, both North and South, and throughout Asia and Africa. And of course, we have examples within Europe as well. So in order to get one national identity, this is where we get these policies of education to assimilate the youth into the morals, the languages, and the values of the dominating group. The practice of assimilation and using education was also perpetrated in Australia with Native groups. Children that suffered under these policies and were forcibly assimilated through residential education are known as the stolen generations. The term is pluralized because the policy lasted nearly 100 years, from the 1890s to the 1970s. Those children that were removed from their homes were hoped to be assimilated into white Australia in an effort to breed out Aboriginal people and solve the Native problem through eugenics. What this policy also did for all Native groups is took away this idea of indigenous lands being for indigenous people, and that they had these rights, and that there was free movement of people. As many of these Native groups were and are nomadic. When you settle people down, it's easier to make them dependent on the state and the capitalist interests. And so by assimilating people into a mindset of being dependent on government to tell you what's right and what's wrong, and to be dependent on companies to sustain you so that you buy your clothing, you buy your food, rather than you make the things your own. You buy machines to do your work instead of using your body and your hands. It limits people's freedom and attaches them more directly to a capitalist settled nation and society. So under these policies of assimilation, with regard to residential schools, boarding schools, these ideas of stealing children. We have 4 responses to the Australian Prime Minister, who apologized for the violent past and these policies, which occurred in 2015. So victims and descendants of these stolen generations speak back, and we can actually apply Sherman Alexi's idea of ordinary magic to these responses, as these 4 individuals speak truth to power. This idea of ordinary magic and these examples of ordinary magic can involve just regular, everyday people doing extraordinary things in sometimes extraordinary circumstances. So ordinary magic can also involve reaching beyond borders, doing everyday things to maintain humanity, power, and agency to exist as human beings in the world. We see this in the case of the 3rd body jump of Sherman Alexi when he becomes the Irish soldier, the old Irish soldier Gus. And we also see it within the young white soldier who Alexi calls Small Saint. And he saves the Indian toddler, also known as Bow Boy. Rather than kill the boy, the young white soldier scoops him up and rides like the wind with Zitz's new vessel, the old Irish soldier named Gus, trailing behind. Alexi shows through this 3rd body jump how revenge dehumanizes and how deep unresolved sorrow and loss can drive people to do terrible things to each other. Conversely, in this same section, we see how the simple act of love, acts of kindness and compassion can turn into bravery. Alexi allows us to critically examine what acts of bravery truly comprise of. Are the tools of war and justice that many cultures glorify truly worthy of the honors we bestow upon them when they dehumanize and cause violence to individuals? Perhaps like Small Saint, those individuals that stand up for their and other humanities through passive acts of resistance and standing with someone beyond their group is braver than the indiscriminate killing in the name of larger armed forces. For some, the mere ability to continue to exist is an act of resistance. And we see actually both of these examples when we look at the Amish people and when they were standing up and picketing for Black Lives Matter in the wake of George Floyd's death. The fact that, first of all, Amish people continue to exist allows them to resist the violence of United States government policy and foreign policy, as well as capitalism. It also, the fact that they are of a Christian sect which admonishes violence and they protest violence is part of the reason why, even though they don't seem like they would be likely friends to the BLM movement, they were actually standing up there and protesting. And then acts of resistance kind of furthering along. In the 100+ years of occupation by British and Israeli groups, Palestinians remain steadfast in their ability to live their lives in their indigenous homelands, much like indigenous people and others throughout the world. And when I say others, I'm also referring to LGBTQIA plus peoples, because a lot of those people have also been subject to discrimination, oppression, and death. And so a common cry of people, of oppressed people around the world, is our very existence is resistance. And that is actually kind of morphed into pickets and signs that say respect our existence or expect our resistance. So the simple act of making your voice heard in defense of injustice or dehumanization as one ordinary person is an example of ordinary magic. And if enough people come together, enough ordinary individuals come together, as we saw in the summer of 2020, and we continue to see, we can create social justice and movements to rehumanize and decolonize and fight for everybody's liberty. So another example of kind of speaking back to power, or speaking back to kind of dehumanizing narratives that are out there, is this little cartoon by Spoiled Socks. That is the person's social media name. So Spoiled Socks talks about the different cultural beliefs with regard to the environment and humans' place in the actual ecosystem. So the little image has this red-haired woman that says, honestly, what is the point of doing anything? Humans are a virus to planet Earth. So yeah, it's kind of like, why not do whatever you want and just be hedonistic, right? And just consume, and it doesn't matter if you fight for whomever's rights. It's all just going to end anyway, because we suck as human beings. And then the converse little image shows a bunch of kind of indigenous looking group of people that says, speak for yourself. And so the eco-fascism kind of mindset states that eco-fascists blame the collapsing of our environment on overpopulation. Humans are a virus is a slogan often used by them to get unknowing people on their side. They are wrong. The world's richest 10% produce half of the global emissions. Shrinking the population wouldn't solve the problem. We have a problem of the rich hoarding resources they don't need, and the poor barely getting by with what they have. Humans are part of our ecosystem, just like any other thing on Earth is. And so that little statement kind of segues us into the indigenous people's perspective. And Spoiled Socks goes on to say, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in indigenous lands. Indigenous people play a vital role in protecting those lands. 28%, including some of the most ecologically intact and biodiverse forest areas, are primarily managed by indigenous peoples, families, smallholders, and local communities. These forests are crucial for curbing gas emissions and maintaining biodiversity. We need to stop using very broad terms like humans when we really should say colonizers or capitalists. So when we look at New York State and who manages the forests of New York State, the majority of those forests remain in small private holding. I believe it's up to 70% is in the hands of small landowners. And so it is up to them, that includes native and non-native peoples, to maintain and protect those areas. And a lot of those people actually do those things. It's other groups of people that just kind of consume and don't really care about or don't really consider themselves a part of the ecosystem, who don't enjoy nature, who just, don't even have a relationship, that they are the ones that don't necessarily understand um, what it means to be um, a an eco-fascist, or what it means to be a steward of the land, right? And actually part of, the cycle of life. So Spoiled Socks goes on to say, I used to say I believe that overpopulation was the reason why we are destroying the environment, and it took me a while to realize that this was completely wrong. Humans as a whole are not a virus, right? When you actually call humans a virus, you're dehumanizing people. They go on to state, we have a place on Earth just like every creature. Colonizers are a virus, right? Colonizers are not human. Capitalists are a virus. I also think that by saying humans are a virus, we erase the work of many indigenous populations who work hard to protect their own land, and as a result, protect a large part of our environment. The indigenous peoples design in this comic were inspired by Tara Hosak, the Ojibwe attorney who has been involved in the protection of Standing Rock at the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was mentioned earlier in this lecture. Another design was inspired by Chief Nomox, who is one of the Wet'suwet'en's hereditary chief. I found all my info through Oxfam and a globaljustice.org article entitled, quote, Humanity isn't a disease, but ecofascism is, end quote, by Ruth Wilkerson. And so this is also an example of how our cultural perspectives can change the way we live in the world, and how we kind of operate in the world as individuals, and how those cultural perspectives can actually allow us to perform everyday or ordinary magic. Lastly, in this section of the book, chapter 15, Alexi shows us through body jumping, time number 4, that Zitz experiences that, end quote, we're all hurting. Pain is a human universal, but thanks to our human plasticity, our mental plasticity, our physical plasticity, we have the capacity to heal and evolve. So just as Zit's character evolves in his emotional maturity, but also in how his presence in other people's experienced lives allows his compassion and empathy to grow. Through his body jump number 4, as the pilot, we learn how damaging stereotypes can be on individuals, and through the cycle of violence that reverberate through the world. In this section, Alexi alludes to the events in 9/11 and the attacks on American capitalism as represented by the Twin Towers, as well as the American foreign policy as represented by the attacks on the Pentagon. And they show how structural violence through laws and foreign policy have real effects on individual lives, and how this can turn into revenge and destruction. The harm we do as individuals can also have long-lasting effects that spiral outwards. And I bring this image of Giuliani and a Saudi prince to mind when Giuliani met with the Saudi prince right after 9/11. Because the Saudi prince visits New York City right after the attacks and presents then the New York City mayor a $10 million check to help rebuild and fund those people in need. Interestingly enough, the Saudi prince said, well, maybe the United States needs to check their foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. And he was speaking about like all the wars and the violence that has been perpetrated in the Middle East through the backing of United States capitalists and the United States military, and all the damage that has, been done to individuals. Now, the people that flew the plane into these the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, they were individual people with families and lives that had been destroyed through various policies that had long-lasting negative effects that involved the United States. And at the same time, yes, it's very true what the Saudi prince said, but looking at this objectively, Giuliani turned the money down because if he were to accept that money, then it would have had him admit that the United States is actually guilty. And for somebody, especially a leader in the United States, to make that statement would be contradictory to everything the United States stands for, which is supposed to be freedom and liberty and democracy for all people throughout the world, right? But these stories that Sherman Alexi tells, they're little kind of short stories, and Sherman Alexi is a short story writer. This is like a book that, kind of compiles them into one, one book that has a common character, that body jumps, and so there's that common thread. He shows the complexity of our society and our cultures. And he also unpacks how, these giant nations like the United States, and you have, these smaller countries that are kind of in the shadow of this great nation, how these international policies can affect individuals as represented by the pilot and his student, right? The Ethiopian student who happens to be Muslim, and how they can actually come to meet each other and connect in this ordinary human way, and humanize each other, and kind of fight and resist these like stereotypes that Islamophobia has promoted, that Muslims are bad. But at the same time, there's so much hurt and so much loss and so much revenge that is in individuals' hearts, that it prevents them from overcoming, and so they end up going through with these heinous acts of resistance and dehumanization, which again affects the lives and has many, many reverberating effects, not only on the individuals who, experience loss because of the events, but it also kind of balloons out to stereotype individuals and groups of people, where again it dehumanizes. And so I thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I hope this contextualized the book a little bit better for you and taught you some cool cultural facts.